So we have talked about I, and we know that I, the imaginary number, is the square root of negative 1. This allows us to take the square root of negative numbers, okay? What we want to look at today is powers of I. When you raise I to powers, there turns out to be a pattern which allows us to do some different stuff when I shows up in a problem, okay? So I is the square root of negative 1. So if I have I squared, that means I'm going to take the square root of negative 1 and square it, or I'm going to multiply it by itself, right? So when I multiply a square root by itself, or when I square a square root, you get what's inside. You get the radicand, okay? So the square root of negative 1 squared is negative 1. So I squared is negative 1. Just as an example, if I take the square root of 2 and square it, that's the square root of 2 times the square root of 2, which is the square root of 4, which is 2. Okay, so when you square a square root, those are inverse operations. They sort of cancel each other out. You get what's inside. So the square root of I squared is negative 1. You get the radicand. Okay, so I is the square root of negative 1. I is the square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1. So the next power of I would be I to the third power. Well, that is, we could split that up into I squared times I, right? Because when you multiply with the same base, you add the exponents. Well, I squared is negative 1. And then we get I, which we just know is the square root of negative 1. So I to the third power is negative I. You take I and you multiply it by negative 1 and you get negative I. So I is the square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1. And I cubed is the opposite of I, or negative I. Well, the last one we want to look at is I to the fourth. Well, I to the fourth is I squared times I squared. And I squared is negative 1. So negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. So I to the fourth power is the same thing as 1. Here are the 4 powers of I you have to know. I is just I, square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1. I to the third power is the opposite of I. And I to the fourth power is 1. Here's why those are the only 4 powers of I you need to know. Let's look at the next few powers of I. If I do I to the fifth, well, that's going to be I to the fourth times I, right? Because when you multiply with the same base, you add the exponents. Well, I to the fourth is 1. I is just I, and I to the fifth is the same thing as I. Let's look at I to the sixth. I to the sixth is I to the fifth times I. Well, we just said that I to the fifth was I, so that's I times I, which is I squared, which is negative 1. Then I to the seventh is I to the sixth times I. That's negative 1 times I, which is negative I, which, by the way, is I cubed. And then I to the eighth is I to the seventh times I. We just said that I to the seventh was the same thing as I cubed. We get the same thing as I to the fourth, which is a positive 1. So what happens with powers of I? I know this is kind of weird, but powers of I go in a pattern of 4. And all you need to know are the first four. Let's write them again. I is just I, which is the square root of -1. I squared is -1. I cubed is -I, and I to the fourth is 1. And here's how you use it. You might need to know what is the value of I to the 15th. Okay? Here's how you do it. You take the 15 and you divide by 4. And you look at the remainder. What's left over? 3. That means I to the 15th is the same thing as I cubed, which is -I. So I to the 15th is -I. Okay? I've written those first four powers again. Let's say I want to know I to the 25th power. I to the 25th power. You take the power, 25, you divide by 4. This goes 6, 6 times 24. You look at the remainder. It's the first power of I, so I to the 25th is the same thing as I, which is the square root of -1. Okay? Let's say we want to know I to the 36th power. You take the 36, you divide by 4. That goes evenly, right? That means there is no remainder, so that means it's the same thing as I to the 4th. It's a multiple or a power of I to the 4th, so that equals 1. All right, first thing I want you to do, you pause the video, write your 4 powers of I. Okay, let's practice finding a couple of more powers of I. Let's say I have I to the 50th. Okay, I to the 50th, you take the 50, you divide by 4. That goes 12 times, remainder 2. So I to the 50th is the same thing as I to the squared, or I to the squared, I squared, which is -1. Okay, what about I to the 31st? Take the 31, divide by 4, you get a remainder of 3. So I to the 31st is the same thing as I cubed, which is -I. So even if you don't understand how these came up, if you will just memorize the 4 powers of I and learn the process of dividing, finding your exponent, then you will be able to work problems involving the powers of I. One more thing I want to show you. They might combine. Let's say I have I to the 99th over I to the 77th, and we need to simplify that. We're going to use our exponent rules. When we're dividing powers with the same base, we subtract the exponents, and 99 minus 77 is 22. Now we can use our little rule. We're going to take the 22, we're going to divide by 4. We get a remainder of 2, so I to the 22nd is the same thing as I squared, which is -1. So this simplifies to -1.